It's been quite a while since Behemoths were added to the game, all the way back in 2022. Man, we're old. But now that Behemoth updates have generally stopped, and the community has generally had time to cool off and form more level-headed opinions, I hope, and as voted as the 9 of you in my poll, I want to take a look at this subtrait, its concepts, its designs, most importantly its gameplay, and what it means for the future of this game. So, without further ado, how bad was Behemoth actually? So in BCJP 11.5, the Behemoth subtrait was added. 3 new Behemoths were added and 3 existing enemies gained the subtrait, starting a trend that will continue for the next 10 updates or so. These enemies, with the exception of only and exactly Raging Gory for whatever reason, were all references to Monster Hunter. In BCJP and probably BC Taiwan version 2, every Behemoth has a prefix that reads as Chao Chou in Chinese or Chouju in Japanese, or when approximately translated to English, Super Beast. In between these two characters is another character that kind of describes the Behemoth itself or the monster that it references. For instance, Rajakong is Chao Tianshou or Chou Tenju, translating to about Super Heavenly Beast, referencing how he is an angel. Or the Folivorian, which is Chao Cishou or Chou Kyuju, translating to about Super Spike or Super Thorn Beast, referencing how he and his reference Nagakuga from Monster Hunter fire spikes from their tails to attack. It's a pretty cool detail that gets lost in translation that I want to bring back up. In terms of visuals, since they're referencing Monster Hunter and Monster Hunter has really cool looking monsters, these guys are bound to look really cool. But that's all I really have to say about theming, so on to gameplay. Now, I briefly alluded to this earlier, but Behemoth isn't a trait in the way that, say, Relic, Aku, and Zombies are, but a subtrait like Colossus and Sage. Unlike Sage that comes with a 70% debuff res, Behemoth is similar to Colossus in that its only real use is for categorization purposes and for the specific counter ability. This doesn't mean that the enemies aren't related though. They all have some amount of common traits. Because this is around 8 years into the game's lifespan, most of the enemies here have comically inflated stats, and also a bunch of immunities. If you have a look at this table here, you can see that every single Behemoth has at least a single immunity except for exactly only Luffy Farm's Angaburu for whatever reason. On average, every Behemoth has 2.09 immunities. Excluding outliers and bosses, which are the 6 enemies you see on screen, each Behemoth still has an average of 2 immunities. This can be made interesting if it forces you to play in a different way than usual, such as with Kurokro, which has freeze immunity which prevents itself from being bombered, with piercing attacks that also kill bomber for the other enemies in the state. But most of these enemies have immunities to basically all of their CC based weaknesses, or absolutely none of them. The only enemies that you would even consider using CC for are Scissorex and Piggycuss, mostly just because Seafarer is an awesome unit. This means that while the units used to counter each Behemoth can vary, the general play pattern of just brute forcing gets really old really quickly. To combat this, the Behemoth Slayer ability gives units 2.5 times damage and takes 0.6 times damage from Behemoths for about a 1.66 times effective health. It also gives a chance to dodge, 5% for 1 second for most units with a couple exceptions. This is a crazy multiplier, probably because 3 versions ago they added Colossus Slayer, which gives 1.6 times damage and 0.7 times damage taken, and that was barely noticeable, so they cranked up the multiplier so you will really feel it. But notice how this does not directly affect CC in any way. In contrast, defensive units gain a pretty big boost, and offensive units get an absolutely insane boost, almost on par with massive damage before treasures. Speaking of which, The implementation of this as an additional ability means that it can stack with massive damage to get 7.5 to 10 times damage. I don't think I need to elaborate on why this is broken. It also means that barring dodge, we can't have any targeted abilities that target all behemoths and only behemoths. Farmoy can't slow all behemoths, Surgeon can't weaken all behemoths, which might have made Surgeon marginally useful. This is a huge loss in design space, basically incentivizing you to use brute force to kill them, which is really annoying when their stats are so overinflated. On top of this, there's always the elephant in the room when it comes to behemoth enemy. No, not Elephante de Papao, I mean Courier. Courier is so completely broken and released at both the start of the Behemoth updates as well as being one of, if not the first eggs that you unlock in-game. He completely counters Ahirujo, as well as being so generally overpowered that even without the extra massive damage multiplier, Courier is still among the best, if not the best, anti-Behemoth unit. So not only are you using brute force every single time, you're using the same unit Courier every single time, which is incredibly repetitive. Not only that, it's so strong that he raises the bar for all future Behemoth Slayer units so high that basically the only other spammable Behemoth Slayer attacker that can actually be used against Behemoth is basically exactly Mushroom. And even then, they get the excuse to make even more otherwise OP enemies that are even less fun to play against. I won't talk about Courier destroying other aspects of the game since I want to stay on topic, but that is another side effect. Then there's the implementation of Behemoth stages and Behemoth stones. These are, to put it bluntly, horrifically implemented. In fact, calling this merely bad would be an insult to the gaming industry as a whole. Most of Behemoth content lies in Behemoth Culling and Empress Excavation. So Behemoth Culling serves as both the progression of Behemoth stages, as well as a farming stage for Behemoth Stone. This is honestly fine on its own, but the problem is how it's handled with regards to timing. I'll compare it to Catfruit stages in this regard, since they're both farming stages used to obtain evolution materials. Catfruit, like Behemoth Stones, come in the same 5 colors. For the 5 weekdays, each day has a different farming stage for one color of Catfruit that lasts the whole day. This means that when there's a specific Catfruit that you want, it's not difficult to get it and you can farm it en masse. Now contrast this to Behemoth Culling. There are 3 different Behemoth Culling maps that appear for a few hours per day. These 3 vary in difficulty and drop different Behemoth Stones. To be specific, they generally have 3 unofficial tiers of Behemoth Stones, which are for red and purple, blue and green, and yellow in its own tier. Then they made the higher tier ones much less likely to drop, which is already annoying but still somewhat tolerable. Until you realize that each Behemoth Culling map can only be cleared once per appearance. So Catfruit farming has RNG. If you're anything like me, you roll the 10% chance to get nothing except driving you off a wall more than a few times. But it was mostly fine because you can just immediately go again. But with Behemoth Culling, not only are the odds worse to get the one that you're looking for, which is most likely a higher tier one and therefore rarer one, you also have to wait until the next day at a specific time to go again. And then again, if you're not chronically online on this game, you will most likely miss the stage or forget about it the next day. And if you are chronically online, then you probably despise waiting with a burning passion. It's just a lose-lose. God forbid you have fun. You also have to wait to progress in the Behemoth Culling saga, as you can only progress at most 3 stages per day, and based on how the difficulty is set, you will most likely not be able to clear all of them at the same pace. And what do you get for clearing the last stage of every Behemoth Culling map? You get 1 rare ticket per map, and I guess Ancient Egg and 112, which evolves into Cat Eggbot, which is a fine unit, but it doesn't feel flashy. It's not a legend cat like you would get for clearing Aku realms or COTC2 or EOC or SOL. Instead, you get units for every 5 stages you clear across the 3 maps, which isn't bad in its own right, but it makes the final reward feel like just another ordinary reward rather than the final payoff to all this Behemoth Culling. And again, Egg Pod is a great unit, but it's not as flashy as something like Gigando or Mechabun, which makes Behemoth Culling seem a lot less like actual progression and a lot more like some random farming stage. Speaking of ancient eggs, the implementation of them also kinda suck in general. You need to farm Behemoth stones, which, like I just said, are a huge pain to farm, and then you need to evolve them. The pre-evolved forms are also useless by designs except as meat shields in Labyrinth or something. This leads to a few major consequences. The first is that we don't get a usable unit at all until you get all the required stones, which come late game is a huge number of stones. The second one, and probably the one you're thinking of, is that these units don't get a chance of redemption. Usually if a unit sucks on release, we can hope their true form will be substantially better, like with Royal Guard and Fried Chicken. Vodka and Boomerang are very weak, basically unusable, but their true forms had some crazy buffs, which really saved the units. This possibility does not exist for eggs, since they're already in true form and won't get anything until Talents or Ultra form, neither of which have had any precedent in non-special or non-gacha unit. It would have been much better if they were more like Nekolugas, where the egg hatches in evolved form, then gets better in true form, which would fulfill the cool idea of hatching an ancient egg that you uncovered from the ground, but also just generally be better for design space too. If you've watched my other videos, you know I always talk about both sides of a given topic. In this case, this is still true, it's just that Behemoths have so much on the bad side and not as much as the good side, but I want to once again reiterate that Behemoths are not without strengths. Like I mentioned earlier, their designs are visually cool, and some of them can be pretty fun if used correctly. Such as Kurokroc, like I mentioned earlier. Freeze Immune only really blocks Bomber, and if you were using Bomber, then you were probably aiming to permafreeze cheese it, and that immunity blocks this, which forces you to play around this rebound the enemy, which is pretty fun. Or perhaps Ariat, acting as an uninterruptible nuke that you have to kill before the attack animation goes off. Some of these enemies, when used well, can actually make good use of their immunities to make a more fun and dynamic stage. Now, perhaps for the most important part of the video, what does this mean for the future? We talk about power creep, but another similar phenomenon has been happening to games in general, which is what I'll call complexity creep. As the gaming industry evolves, people play games for longer, and are more easily able to grasp mechanics and are more familiar with simpler mechanics. Hence, there is a need to make more complex mechanics to keep games interesting for a veteran audience. Plus, with the advancement of technology in the gaming industry, more complex mechanics are now actually physically possible. Taking Honkai Star Rail as an example, look at Zila, the original Quantum Hypercarry girl with butterfly motifs, and compare it to Castoris, the newest Quantum Hypercarry girl with butterfly motifs. The game has shifted a lot since then. As you can see, Castoris has much more text than Zila. Or Hearthstone, where I stumbled upon this Reddit post quite a while ago, where you can see the average card text length for each expansion over time, where you see there is a generally increasing trend. Or even Bloons TD6, where new updates are much more complex than older ones. Quincy and Gwendolyn are much less complex than Geraldo and Corvus, for instance, and newer towers like the Beast Handler and Mermonkey are much more complicated than older towers, like Wizard or Ninja. Note that the point here is not that they're getting stronger over time, it's definitely happening, but not the main point here. The point is that they're getting more complex over time. In the case of Bloons TD6 though, the developers over at Ninja Kiwi have explicitly addressed this, and actively made newer towers more simple, like the comparatively simpler Rosalia and Desperado. But I've seen no other developers address this, and if it continues, games will be much less approachable for new players. Which leads me back to the Battle Cats. This game has also generally becoming much more complex as of recent updates. Though to prove that this is the case, look at the Behemoth enemies. With only 2 exceptions, all of them have some kind of other ability on top of the immunities. Gone are the days where new enemies have no abilities. Overall though, I would say this is a good thing because the Battle Cats is already really unapproachable for new players as is, and these new complex mechanics are often introduced much later into the game, which for later game players who do understand what's going on, more complexity means more room for strategy and more depth for strategy, which is overall better. Though put a pin in that more room for strategy, I'll get back to that later. Back to the Battle Cats, it also means that Ponos is shifting away from CC on units. Due to the power of our insane roster of CC units, any enemies without a couple immunities or resists will get obliterated pretty easily. Also, Ponos has been experimenting with more subtraits and in fact have already come up with Sages and Sage Slayer, which encompass these 2 shifts in design philosophy really well. And I would say that as a whole, Ponos has done pretty well. Sages have a 70% debuff resistance. This disincentivizes but doesn't completely stop CC, but at the same time it does also have to be all or nothing, where they, at least for now, can't exclusively resist only slow and freeze or only weaken and knockback. Meanwhile, the counter ability of Sage Slayer allows the unit to deal 1.2 times and take half damage, while also bypassing the CC resist. Unlike Behemoth Slayer, you see, this ability has much more focus on utility and defense, and this matters a lot since every Sage Slayer unit has either some form of CC, which is enabled by Sage Slayer, or ED, whose increased health matters a ton for a rebound unit. That's a topic for another video, I'm not getting into rebound here. In any case, the focus on defense of Sage Slayer and the lack of a single centralizing unit, like He Who Shall Not Be Named, makes Sage Slayer much more interesting. But the start of Behemoths, and especially Sages, marked the start of another slightly more subtle and worrying trend in design philosophy, which I'll call the lock and key philosophy. Especially since the start of the Behemoth updates. It's easier to illustrate with examples, so let's pull that table back up. Now, most of these enemies have had a cat that targets that trait with Behemoth Slayer introduced at or around that version. Let's not talk about how effective the counter is yet. This section is about design intent. Now, do you notice that the enemies that have clearly designated hard counters are, generally speaking, much more unreasonable and much more overpowered than those without? Rajakong, Megamajo, Ibilujan, especially Hazuku, are much more unreasonable than those with less direct or no hard counters at all, like Kurokraq, Ariant, Cumulus Gallus, or Angaburu. This philosophy, in my opinion, is not good. This game is a strategy game at heart, and picking out and using the same hard counter every single time isn't really that strategic or that fun. Also, as a less direct effect, they typically balance the enemy around having the hard counter, meaning that the stages that contain them are typically much harder or downright impossible without said hard counter. And especially if the hard counter they designated doesn't end up working, like with Hazuku, where Surgeon is so incompetent that Hazuku is still a headache even in late game. This can be seen with Sages too, though to a lesser extent. Such as when they first introduced this subtrait with the atrocity that is Soractes, where in the next update 13.2, they introduced Pegasa, a unit that can outrange Soractes and weaken him through the resist thanks to Sage Slayer, which significantly reduces his pushing power. The next update, they released Dark Dober, which would theoretically be countered by Akechi Mitsuhide in 13.4. In that same version, they released Dr. KO, a red sage enemy that's targeted by White Rabbit's Ultra Form, which was also released that version. The following version, in 13.5, they introduced Gunduros-Therian, my favorite Uber, but that was most likely made to counter the aforementioned Dober Dark, as evidenced by the otherwise out-of-place wave immunity, as well as the newly introduced Technoid Hyena. As of writing this, the newest version is 14.5, though in recording it's already 14.6, and by the time this sees the light of day it'll be 14.7. They introduced a new Angel Sage Taki, and the new Almighty Skanda is a rusher that weakens angels as well as rented aliens with Sage Slayer. I can talk about more examples, but I think you get the point. Countering enemies nowadays really just means bringing the specifically designated hard counter or waiting a version or two for said hard counter to release. A philosophy that really started with Behemoths and continued for Sages. Maybe it'll take a whole new subtrait for them to realize that this design philosophy is a mistake. Although, to their credit, this whole lock and key thing has lessened overall since the Behemoth updates, since these hard counters are Ubers and thankfully they still don't yet balance stages around having specific Ubers. Alright, I think that's all I have to say about Behemoth. I did get somewhat sidetracked this time. I don't often get opportunities to talk about complexity creep, and hopefully I was able to trick a decent number of you to listen to me talk about design philosophy and game design and complexity creep. All topics that I'm personally really interested in. This turned out to be way longer than I initially realized, but if you're anything like myself, then you probably don't mind. As usual, let me know what you think about this video in the comments, any future videos you want to see, any objections you might have, anything you want to add on, all that. Alright, thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye!